Hartelijk welkom. En na deze reclameboodschap, very warm welcome to The Emperor Strikes Back. A few weeks ago, Bali editor Eloise Casius came up with this title, the title of tonight's event, The Emperor Strikes Back. Little did we know, of course, that Donald Trump would once again outdo even the most absurd metaphors. On May the 4th, he used an AI to depict himself as a hero from the Star Wars saga. The image was accompanied by a caption. I read the caption to you. Happy May the 4th to all of you, including the radical left lunatics who are fighting so hard to bring Sith lords, murderers, drug lords, dangerous prisoners and well-known MS-13 gang members back into our galaxy. You're not the rebellion, you're the empire. May the 4th be with you. But the AI, I might say, knew him better than he knew himself. It portrayed him wielding the red lightsaber of the Sith Lords. The incarnations of evil led by the Emperor who rules the galaxy through fear and totalitarian power. So it's very nice to welcome you here all. My name is Juri Albrecht. I'm the Artistic Director and Executive Director of the Bali and trying to lead this conversation tonight. We believe it's very important to host programs about the rule of law, especially the rule of law. And we thank the VEEfonds for that. They make this evening possible. The VEEfonds, the Fonds voor Vrede, Vrijheid en Veteranen. And tonight we will discuss the attacks on the US Constitution by President Trump. Since January 6th, Trump has been president of the United States. Of course, we know that, for the second time. And on day one, he started with a lot of executive orders, 1,600 pardons, even for the Capitol rioters, people like the Proud Boys and other white supremacists and those sort of people, to cover up maybe his attempt 4 years earlier at a coup d'etat. It seems as if he is seeking revenge, helping his friends and attacking his enemies, like the Emperor maybe. Therefore, we asked Professor Kim Wheely to speak here at the Bali about those attacks on the rule of law. She is a prominent American lawyer, author and commentator. She writes, among others, at the Atlantic Monthly, where in February she wrote a warning to the Americans that the law in the Trump era no longer stands on their side. Additionally, she wrote many other things. A book last year, Pardon Power, which covers the presidential power to grant pardons to individuals. We might later on talk about those 1,600 rioters. As an expert in she's an expert in constitutional law, and she knows better than anyone else how vulnerable the American legal system is. I recommend her for her personal courage. She's been speaking out quite for some while now, and I think we recommend that she's here again. I'm very happy that you're here, and recommend you for your really personal power and courage in these. At the moment, visiting professor at Leiden University, if I'm not mistaken, invited by Professor Wim Voermans, and normally also tenured professor at the School of Law at the University of Baltimore. Give her a really warm round of applause.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and it's really a tremendous honor to be here. Professor Voermans at Leiden, as well as the Fulbright Commission of the Netherlands, which has sponsored this semester here. And people ask me all the time, what do I think of the Netherlands? And I love it. So it feels very comfortable as an American to be standing here having this discussion. I'm actually taught law now for 17 years, and I'm a mom of 4 daughters, and never planned to actually be involved in the media, television, radio, and in the last 8 years, I've probably racked up 1,000 of these kinds of appearances altogether, because when Trump first took office, I was reading the New York Times one Sunday, which I love to do with my 2 little dogs and my coffee, and there was a column that said the president's pardon power is absolute, that there's no restrictions on the president's ability to pardon or forgive federal crimes. And I said, that can't be right because we have a system of checks and balances. So, for example, if a president were to take a bribe for a pardon, that would maybe be a problem. Or if the president were to only pardon white people, that would be a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. So I wrote my first column for the Baltimore Sun. And at the time, I still am, was under contract with Cambridge University Press to write a scholarly book. And Baltimore Sun, I started writing some more. And then the radio outlets would read my columns, invite me to speak on the radio. Then CBS, I think, was the first. Then it was CNN. Then it snowballed. And I found myself writing a different book. And it's called How to Read the Constitution and Why. And HarperCollins took the book in 24 hours. And I think we were onto something, which is that back then, there were some concerns about the legitimacy and the longevity of American democracy. And I wish I could say here that I was wrong or we were wrong. But now, last week on Monday, I was one of 35 experts that were quoted in a long New York Times column. Constitutional law experts across the United States asked if we're in a constitutional crisis. And the consensus was yes, which frankly was a relief for me, because one of the things that's been happening in the United States is cognitive dissonance. Some of us are saying, listen, this is serious, but many people don't want to talk about it. I call it toxic optimism. They don't want to hear it. American exceptionalism, it's almost a religiosity around the Constitution. And so I want to start, and I know we've got a lot of experts and lawyers in the room, so forgive me if this is too basic, but I want to start with what I explain to lay audiences in the United States, and lawyers, frankly, about how the Constitution functions. And if this is really redundant, I suggest maybe it would be helpful when you're trying to explain to other people why this is a concern. And I think it's a concern not just for Americans, and we can talk about that in the conversation. Of course, a Revolutionary War was fought in America to throw off the yoke of King George III. You might have heard of the musical Hamilton. This is not hard to understand that one thing American democracy is not is an unlimited monarchy. No more kings. There was a famous cartoon on Saturday mornings in the 70s called Schoolhouse Rock, and there was a song, No More Kings. And what I explain to people is that unlimited monarchy looks like a pyramid or a triangle. And the power of the sovereign comes from the divine right of kings. And it trickles down to all of the subjects. And it's whether you have rights or not is contingent on whether you are in good graces with the king. You get goodies or not so goodies based on the subjective approach to the king. The American Constitution flips that upside down. It's an inverted triangle. The power is with the people, and it trickles down to the president and to two other branches. The king was split into a three-headed monster. When I started this in 2015, the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania, every year they do a study. 3,000 Americans are asked about basics in the Constitution. In 2015, only 1/3 of Americans could name the three branches: executive, judicial, and legislative, if that's you. I know they're not all Americans in here. But also in 2015, there was a survey of recent college grads. 10% thought that Judge Judy, the TV star, was on the US Supreme Court. So the good news is, since then, that's flipped. 2/3 of Americans can name the three branches. I don't know so much about Judge Judy. But when I explain to people that, okay, we've got this messy thing at the top, it's difficult to get consensus. Everybody doesn't get what they want. You gotta give stuff up. But the idea is no concentration of power in one place. No concentration of power in one place. So what's happened with American democracy? Why are we where we are right now? Power has been concentrated in one place, in one man, by the name of Donald Trump. And this is not new. In February or March of 2022, I did a column for Politico magazine that followed up on a thought experiment that I did with my law students, where we took a whiteboard and wrote all the checks and balances on a president on the board. And I think we counted 25 or 26. And we went through and said, is this still working anymore? Is this still working anymore? Is this still working? And the only one that was still functioning, we thought, as a disincentive for bad behavior, was a criminal indictment. And if you noticed, last summer in June of 2024, the United States Supreme Court took out a black magic marker and crossed that one off the list as well. In fact, the Supreme Court effectively amended the Constitution to add unlimited criminal authority, the ability to commit crimes with impunity, added that to the Constitution for presidents. So long as the president uses the actual official power, the scary stuff, the military, the DOJ, the FBI, the CIA, then those crimes are above the law, above the rule of law. So that's the short of it. That's where we are. Now, Americans, and I speak to a lot of groups. I do a TV show frequently. It's called C-SPAN, where we have callers in from Democratic, Republican, independent line. And I think Americans seem to think that rights for me but not for thee is okay. That we can have this dissonance of a constitution with rights, but a dictator in the White House, so long as he's exercising his power against the thee, not the me. So I'll ask people, when I have these groups, I say, okay, well, we have constitutional rights. Yeah, we have constitutional rights. What does it mean to have a constitutional right? What does that mean? I do this with my law students a lot. There's a lot of terminology that we just assume people know, but when you ask even law students in the United States, who are graduate students, they can't answer it. And this is one of those things. What is a right? So you might be asking this in your own mind. There's some rights in the Netherlands. I think there are a lot more articles in your constitution than ours, although it's, my understanding, the second oldest in the world, thanks to my colleague, Wim Bormans, who's taught me some things. So the question then becomes, if you have this right, people will say, it's mine, I'm born with it. It's like the tooth fairy or Santa Claus. It just comes down the chimney and it's mine, I have this right. And I say, okay, do you have a right to go in your home? Yeah, I have a right to go in my home. I pay my mortgage, I pay my rent. Well, what happens if one day you come home and there are armed police officers surrounding your home? What happens to your right? And they'll say, well, I guess I call the police. Well, that's not a good answer anymore, because the police are keeping you from your house. So eventually we get to the point, you get a lawyer, you go to a judge, you get an order, and the judge issues the order, and you take the order, and the police leave because there's some source of law, the rule of law, that is telling you telling the police officers to let you in. Another example that I use that really lands with Americans is a speed limit, right? That's like the Constitution. 50 kilometers per hour, we'll blow through the speed limit, we'll go 60 because no one's looking. One day, there's that machine that's hiding someplace in the bushes, and 2 weeks later, you get a ticket in the mail, at least we do in the United States. In Washington, it's like $150. Everyone slows down for those 2 blocks after that. It's the consequences for speeding, not the speed limit, that slows us down. As I said, I have 4 kids. If you have a rule, no eating in the living room, except for the Super Bowl, the kids know there's no eating in the living room rule is not a rule. That's literally what's happened with the American presidency, and it started long before Donald Trump. So that's the structure of the Constitution. How did we get, number 2, where are we? Where are we? You've probably seen stuff on TV or heard about a lot of it. I liken it to playing tennis against an army of ball machines. Even as a constitutional law expert, it's too much too fast to even keep track of. But I'll give you some of the highlights. You've probably read about them. The Due Process Clause dates back to the Magna Carta, the most basic idea. Before the government can take your life, can execute you, can take your liberty, put you in jail, or take your property, you get two things. You get notice of what you did wrong, and you get a hearing before someone to give your side of the story, to test the government's proof, to say I wasn't there, to say you have an alibi. You get those two things. You might still go to jail. You might still in the United States get executed, but you get to have your say. That's been dispensed with now hundreds of people in the United States, including recently a number of children who are actually U.S. citizens, but most prominently, folks that were deported to El Salvador, to a high security torture prison with no notice of what they did wrong and no opportunity to be heard. This has gone up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in kind of wishy-washy language, said, yeah, you get due process. They should have due process. But guess what? The position of the administration is so long as we take you out of the country, you're not protected by the Constitution, period. And so far in this moment, they haven't, those folks have not come back, notwithstanding multiple judges' orders. First Amendment. We had a discussion before this at dinner about these law firms, right? $1 billion with a B in money pledged by law firms to keep the Trump administration from retaliating against them if they represent enemies of the Trump administration. People like Hillary Clinton, Jack Smith, the special prosecutor. A judge recently in Washington declared that unconstitutional with respect to Perkins Coie that represents Hillary Clinton. She said it's a First Amendment violation. It's a Sixth Amendment violation. You can't tell people they can't have counsel or who they can't have counsel. So far, I read before coming here, there's 140 judges' orders already against the Trump administration. So this gets to the toxic optimism. Oh, isn't this great, right? Isn't this great? Things are turning around. Well, judges do not have an army. They might issue the order for the cops to walk away, but their law enforcement apparatus is called the United States Marshal Service, and that's controlled by Donald Trump. So there's no way ultimately to enforce these orders. Birthright citizenship, the Supreme Court took that case. That's clear as crystal in the U.S. Constitution. If you're born in the United States, unless you have parents who are diplomats, you have citizenship. That's been ignored. The Emoluments Clause, short way of saying presidents can't take gifts. We have this massive grift to the tune by a recent report of almost $6 billion that the president and his family have gained off of his Bitcoin currencies and the currency exchange. His family gets 75% of the transactions, the fees for this exchange. And some members of Congress have said it's just basically going up to him and saying, here's the money, do something for me. So I could go on. How did we get here? This is the big question. Well, there's a lot of reasons for it. I blame the Supreme Court to a large degree, not just because of Trump versus US, but because of something called the Voting Rights Act. So we had a shameful history of enslavement in the United States. A war was fought, a civil war was fought, and we had 3 amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is a biggie. We have the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that includes free speech, religion, guns. The 14th Amendment has 2 things in it, the Due Process Clause that applies to the states and something called equal protection. It's from that language that was designed to tell the southern states primarily that, listen, even though the original Constitution declared these people 3/5 human and treated them like property based on their race, they're full humans. Out of that language has sprung the affirmative action cases, sprung abortion rights. That's how we have the right to decide our own medical care, the right to decide who we're even married to, regardless of what the LGBTQ status is or racial status. A lot of rights in America are read into that ambiguous equal protection and due process clause. But also, the voting rights were not adhered to after the Civil War. It wasn't until the 1960s that in the Voting Rights Act under Lyndon B. Johnson, with the help of Martin Luther King Jr., that voting rights were enforced through a separate statute, the rule of law. The Supreme Court has quietly, prominently deactivated that statute over several years, as recently as last year. They also declared corporations basically human beings with birth certificates who enjoy First Amendment speech, which means if you've got a lot of money, if you're a billionaire or a corporation, you could influence elections because you speak through advertising. That shifted the loyalty of our elected leaders to money instead of voters. So people think Americans are kind of kooky. What are you thinking? Voting against your interests, this whole MAGA block. But a majority wants abortion rights. A majority wants reasonable gun control. The numbers are in the high double digits. We're not getting it. We haven't had a Congress that listens to the people for a very long time. Meanwhile, and this surprises some Dutch people, we do pay high taxes. I mean, in the higher brackets, I'm not in the highest, but it's over 40%. We don't have a social safety net. We don't have housing. We don't have health care. We don't have a pension system. There's food insecurity. 1 in 5 children in America don't have enough food. They get their primary food at school, which now the Trump administration is planning to gut or started the process of gutting the Department of Education. So there are millions of Americans who have to choose between food or medicine for their families. They're working multiple shift jobs. They don't have any benefits. They don't know where to go, and American government hasn't worked for them. The Democrats haven't worked for them. And so in comes this strong person, and he promises, I'll fix it. And guess what? The problem is the non-white people. The problem is the women. And then for that, you can project whatever you want on that. But I'll save you. Meanwhile, we have these mega churches, and the messages coming through the leaders of these mega churches associates Donald Trump and the right wing, which is now the Republican Party, with Jesus, with God. So if you believe that Jesus can fix things, you don't need a policy. You don't need a list of reforms. It's Jesus. So that's how we got where we are, and there's reasons why the Supreme Court is, in my view, corrupt and biased and ideological. That has to do with politics, getting rid of the supermajority required to put Supreme Court justices on the court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, almost 100% support from the United States Senate. The last few, 50%. Meanwhile, tens of millions go into the Supreme Court nomination process. It's become a political football, and here we are. So I mentioned toxic optimism. There are some good things. So what are people looking for? What are the bright sides of where we are? Well, I said we had 140 orders by federal judges. Some important things have been struck down. Elon Musk is slinking out of Washington with his Tesla brand in tatters. We have the U.S. Attorney in D.C., who is an election denialist, that is, believes the 2020 election was stolen from Joe Biden and the voters, thinks, as Donald Trump has said, that the bloody day of January 6, 2021 was a festival of love. Looks like his nomination is going to be thwarted. Joe Rogan, the right-wing podcaster, has come out against these illegal, unconstitutional deportations. But we've got some protests too. Bernie Sanders, AOC, people are getting it. But at the end of the day, the question, and I hope we can have this discussion here, and tell me where I'm missing something. I still am wondering, where's the ticket for speeding in the White House? Protests are not going to stop what's happening in the first 100 days. We have a midterms coming up. The Congress can pass more laws that Donald Trump ignores. If it goes Democrat, they could impeach him. That's failed the last 3 times. And he controls the military. And the Supreme Court has said he could do whatever he wants with that. We have states, so we have a dispersed pluralistic government. States have their own turf, but also they don't have a military. So this is all a downer, I get it. And so I do want to leave on a bit of a high note, but it's something I really believe. As I told you, I am a mother of 4. I come from Buffalo, New York, a kind of blue-collar town. My mother didn't finish college. My grandparents didn't finish the 7th grade. My grandmother emigrated from Ukraine. And I learned from a very small age that when life gets hard, you have to identify what matters to you and you hang on to those values. And I teach that to my children. And before I came, I did a speech to 400 elderly in Florida, mostly MAGA. And I started, and we identified common values. And by the end, we were all singing the preamble to the Constitution. And I say that because I think it means there really is a spirit of America that's still there if it's tapped. One of our most revered presidents is Abraham Lincoln. And I think people forget that he trespassed some parts of the Constitution as well. Congress has the power to declare war. It did not declare any civil war. The habeas corpus is the ability to challenge your confinement. The Constitution says Congress is the only body that can lift habeas corpus. Abraham Lincoln did it in order to keep the Union together. He also signed a document called the Emancipation Proclamation, which is kind of like an executive order. If you've heard of those lately, executive orders. Nothing in the Constitution actually authorizes the president to issue these edicts called executive orders. They date back, nonetheless, to George Washington. But when Lincoln started the war, his goal was to keep the Union together, which meant making a deal with the South about slavery. The southern states wanted to expand into the West. And remember, I said, due process, life, liberty, or property. Enslaved people were property. So Abraham Lincoln understood that he couldn't do anything constitutionally about slavery because they're property, and it's in the Constitution that owners of enslaved people have the rights to their property. He made a decision at some point to go for something, a higher value. And Noah Feldman, who's a constitutional professor at another law school in the United States, writes about how he took out of the rupture of American democracy that was a civil war, the rupture, some higher calling, a higher value. And that's honestly where I see we are. It's not exactly the most satisfying answer, but we are rupturing in the United States. And I hope, like Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends towards justice, that just like the leadership under Lincoln, appealing to higher angels, that in the next few months, we're going to see a lot more disintegrate and a lot of horrors coming out of the United States. But I hope we'll see some growth on the other side that is maybe greener and brighter than we've seen in the course of American history.
Yeah, thank you very much for that speech, that depressing speech in many ways, though. We're going to have a talk about many things in your speech and also on Dutch sort of part of it, maybe. Let me introduce 2 of the panelists here at the table, and then I'm having a few questions for you, and we break the conversation with you. And you, the audience, as always, are very much invited after the conversation to join in with questions later this evening. So you might take already a mental note, maybe. I would like to introduce to you one of my guests tonight, Laila Frank, journalist and researcher, specializes in the United States. Very warm welcome to you. Published among other things, but more recently a series called Welcome in Washington, a podcast series. And since April 21 of this year, you are the presenter of the radio program Bureau Buitenland van de VPRO, National Public Broadcaster. You just returned from the United States, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
You're right. 2 weeks ago.
That's great. So we can get also the latest information on that. And of course, here also like to introduce Professor Geert-Jan Knoops. He's a lawyer in international and criminal law, professor by special appointment of politics of international law at the University of Amsterdam, and a visiting professor of international criminal law in Shandong University in China. He has significant influence in the field of international law, particularly in human rights, international law, and the defense of international criminal cases. Many of these cases were played out in the US or involved defending Americans as well. Just a few days ago, he published and released his latest book, When the Rule of Law Fails, where he also covers what he calls the Trumpian rule of law. And please give both of them a warm round of applause. Ja, als de rechtsstaat faalt, wat onrecht met de burger doet voor de Nederlanders onder ons. Maybe just to start out, a few questions on what you just described. And I was wondering, just a very personal one. How do you feel about your freedoms as an American citizen? How do you personally, now you're here, about your academic and journalistic and civil freedoms, personally?
I'm concerned. I mean, I stand at this intersection of scholarship and academia and media, which is, there are not many of us. And the due process piece is important in part because Donald Trump has said publicly that the next frontier are, quote, homegrowns. He told Bukele, a Salvadoran president, that he needs to build 5 more prisons. And Justice Sotomayor, in a dissenting or a concurring opinion relating to Kilmar Abrego Garcia, one of the Maryland man who was sent to El Salvador, she said that there's no restraints on now Donald Trump and the Trump administration deporting to prison camps American citizens. So I think one thing about Donald Trump, he follows through on what he promises. I don't think I'm at the top of the list, but what I say to people, and I said this for many years, we have a First Amendment. The concern is that if you start tailoring your speech out of fear of retaliation, you tailor your thought. And when you start constraining your thought, then the question is what's left of you and your humanity. It goes very core to who you are. But I'll tell you, I'm not quieting down anytime soon. So. That's very concise, because once you start tailoring your language, then your thoughts, and then your own humanity, so your personal existence. That's how quick it goes and how deep it goes, and so how deep it runs. Yeah. And I can already see in my own law school, there was a letter that a colleague initiated just establishing the rule of law for our students, an email saying, we might disagree about politics, but the rule of law matters. You can't be impeaching and retaliating against judges, which is what the Republican Party's been doing with federal judges. And not everyone in my own law school, even this early, would sign it. So we had to sign it in our personal capacities because the full faculty did not feel comfortable signing it for whatever reason. So I don't know what it'll be in a year.
Wait a moment, but everybody had to decide whether he would sign it or not.
Correct.
And most people didn't.
No, I actually didn't. I would say most did, but there was a significant number that didn't, that I think was disheartening to the students and to some of us on the faculty that are out here every day talking about these things.
I mean, this is really chilling. I mean, a lot of things you just said are really chilling, but you have to. It's an
internal email. It's an internal email.
That reminds, I think, everybody here who knows a little bit about the Second World War, about the German occupation, where professors had to sign a sort of anti-Semitic pamphlet that they weren't Jews, and there was a very famous Leiden professor, Cleveringa, who didn't, who was sort of the first resistance thing. And so they actually signed.
Well, I mean, no, this was in support of the rule of law, but not everyone felt comfortable even adhering to something that basic as a law faculty in the United States, that it was controversial to put your name on an email to our students saying the rule of law matters and we are a faculty of law.
And people didn't dare.
People did not dare. I mean, you've also probably heard Barnard College, the general counsel of Barnard, which is the sister school to Columbia, the general counsel was asked to give the personal cell phone numbers of the faculty, and she turned them over, and they were sent questionnaires about their experience and their view of anti-Semitism and Jews. And she said, well, nothing's banning me from doing that. So Georgetown was sent a letter by Ed Martin. I mentioned he's not going to be confirmed, it looks like, but he's the acting U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. Georgetown Law was sent a letter basically threatening them if they did not purge diversity, equity, and inclusion from their curriculum, which is the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which of course was enacted after the Civil War to address slavery. So I don't know how you're a law school if you're not going to teach about the Civil War. Georgetown had sent a very pointed response back. You've probably heard Harvard has sued the Trump administration. Some law firms have sued the Trump administration. There was a win this week. So we're mixed, but we're early.
You're saying I'm probably not on the top of the list, but I mean, already the fact that there might be a list and you might be somewhere on that list.
We know there's a list because Kash Patel had a list when he's the FBI director. And
do we know who's on that list?
I know people who are on the list, yes. Yeah.
Because they've been noted?
Well, it was public before he took office, yeah.
Wow. Timothy Snyder, Professor Timothy Snyder, who'd been in the same chair as you're now in this room, just said that he will leave the United States because that's the best thing you can do because dictatorship is coming. Correct.
He's not the only one. Several have left Yale to go to Toronto, and I know there are people that are looking for Plan Bs.
And how would you personally think about that?
I love the Netherlands, I told you. That's true. I do love it. I love riding my bike. I don't have to get in my car. I don't have to deal with beltway traffic in Washington. All the things.
Duly noted. I think let's see whether there's somebody in charge at the Leiden University who...
Well, thank you for that very kind question. For the compassion, yeah.
Can I turn to you? Because thank you for this personal note as well. Just to sort of get it really drive the message home in many ways. I
have to do the calculus in my mind. Now, when I write a column and I file the column, I have to think about every sentence and if I'm okay putting that sentence in there. And I never had to do that before. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds pretty much like a state without a real good rule of law. May I ask you both what struck you in the lecture we just had, the talk we just heard? Maybe Laila, if I might start with you.
A couple of things, I would say. Let me start by stating something positive that we tend to forget, which is kind of the irony of the Trump presidency is that political engagement is so much larger. More people turn out to vote. More people are educated about what it actually is, the Constitution. We talk about it a lot. Well, that's basically everything.
Constitution's sexy.
Yeah, exactly. You know, all of a sudden, government is sexy, politics is sexy, all of that. So that was my shining light, my star for tonight. So now we're gonna go down, right? What struck me is the words that you chose, toxic optimism. And I think that doesn't just resonate in the US, it resonates here as well, in Europe. And I struggle with the question, how do you get from toxic optimism towards activism or towards action? Because I see a lot of people in the US there's a lot of tension in society in the US. People are on edge and everybody knows it affects them, but people are paralyzed. So I struggle with that question. How do you break this, I don't know, rabbit in the traffic light kind of mode? And I don't have an answer for it, but it's something I'm looking for. Where is the resistance and what does it look like? And where's the breaking point? What else struck me? The military. And that's also a question I have, actually, because if we talk about resistance, then the military, to me, is a big question mark, because it's such a closed-off institution in itself. And you hope there's resistance there, but we don't really get, we don't really see inside. And that's one of the big question marks for me as well. What's going to happen with that? And we saw that Pete Hegseth the Ministry of Defense just fired a bunch of high military people. What are we looking at there? What's happening there? So that's actually a question.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a surgical one that kind of goes to the heart of the threat, which is who's going to issue the tickets for speeding. And his power really is around having the might of law enforcement and the military. It's kind of like the biggest bully on the playground. I've looked into this a little bit, and it turns out that everyone in the United States military, except for the very bottom level, the infantry people, they only take an oath to the Constitution.
That's it,
The
right?
soldiers at the bottom take an oath to the Constitution and the Commander-in-Chief. Some of the more senior people in the military have their own lawyers, their military lawyers, whose job it is to advise just them. So it doesn't go up a single general counsel. Like, they have certain lawyers that are supposed to give them that advice. There are definitely MAGA people in the military. There's a lot of MAGA in the police force. We saw this with the 1,600 criminal convictions around January 6th. There were a lot of law enforcement that was there, or I mean, surprising number, I should say, on the mall. But anecdotally, I literally had this conversation because I've been asked this question. I did some lectures in Germany earlier, and I was asked this very question. I had a conversation with a friend, or a text exchange, who's senior in the military right now, went to Naval Academy, and I asked them, his take was that they're not going to go along with this, that people in the military really do believe in the promise of America, the Constitution, their oath. They take it very seriously. And I do see this with my students. I love the military students because they're on time, they're respectful, they're always prepared. It's just great. That's what I know, but that is a big question.
Yeah, and it's like the shining light if war really breaks out, sort of.
Or some kind of domestic, sort of skirmish. Trump issued an executive order recently directing Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, as well as the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to explore the use of the military to supplement local law enforcement, and said if law enforcement gets sued, presumably for legal violations, constitutional violations, this army of the best lawyers in Washington that have pledged $1 billion in free legal fees will then become their lawyers. So he has promised now for a long time. He thought about doing it on January 6th. He did it with that famous holding up the Bible in what was Black Lives Matter plaza around the George Floyd protest. He has promised invoking the Insurrection Act. That can't be written off as a real possibility. And as you said, he fired women and people of color at the top ranks. So it's really impossible to know behind the scenes what's happening. I'm sure there are conversations, though.
Yeah.
Thank you. Gert-Jan Koops,
Yes.
the same sort of first question.
Yeah.
What did struck you?
Two elements. Thank you, first for your inspiring speech. First of all, what struck me was the issue of the 14th Amendment, respect for the 14th Amendment, the due process clause. Actually, what you describe is something we also see in Europe, which is quite worrisome. A shift into the criminal law system from a model which was meant to protect the citizens against the power of the state towards
Habeas corpus.
Habeas corpus is one of the elements of it, towards a system which is meant to crime fighting. So the government is using criminal laws, laws in general, as an instrument to restrict the rights of citizens instead of protection of citizens. That's something we also see in Europe with many. When I started 35 years ago as a criminal defense lawyer, a mistake in a prosecution, a non-disclosure of exculpatory evidence, was immediately sanctioned by a judge. And nowadays in Europe, you see it in France, in Belgium, in my country, that judges under the pressure of society, and society means also the legislative power, are not willing to actually protect the rights of citizens in court anymore, to a certain extent. It is something which I also describe in this book. One of my inspirations was to show the audience what is happening with our criminal law system. One of the examples, of course, that President Trump actually abandoned the moratorium on death penalty, meaning that he sort of ordered all the federal executions to be reinstalled. My law firm is part of the American Innocence Network. Actually, the director is behind you, is my colleague, Mrs. Carrie Knopf-Hamburger. Since 2011, we are admitted to the American Innocence Network. We work closely with the New York Innocence Project, Ohio Innocence Project of Professor Gotzi. By the way, these projects are also sanctioned by the cutting of the budget by President Trump. And these projects are not NGOs to, on a pro bono basis, actually investigate closed criminal cases where there is reasonable doubt that somebody was correctly convicted. Now, in 2023 only, more than 160 people were exonerated due to the work of this Innocence Project in the United States. In every state you have an Innocence Project. We do it in Europe for them. That means that the administration of Trump has a huge impact on the work for Innocence Project and also for the protection of the rights. Death penalty cases are the most terrible cases to do. As you might know, the state of Texas is still one of the few states where the federal death penalty is still in place. Now, the moratorium is abandoned by Trump. This is also an example of the abandonment of the 14th Amendment, the due process clause. So what struck me in your speech was indeed the invasion of the 14th Amendment from a different perspective, but actually there is a similarity with the same development in Europe. The second aspect which struck me in your speech was the sanctioning of legal institutions. You mentioned the lawyers, defense lawyers, but also I work since 2014 as defense lawyer at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. I do now my second case for the defense, for a former minister of the Central African Republic. And actually two of my friends are American prosecutors. Nobody has actually any clue that despite the United States is not a ratifying state party of the ICC, there are 4 American prosecutors working there. One of my friends, he is an American prosecutor, and as you know, in the first term of President Trump, he already issued sanctions against the ICC. Now, in January of this year, one of his first decrees was a decree which sanctions the prosecution service members from the United States. And this also has an impact on the 14th Amendment indirectly, because prosecutors, defense lawyers, we are part of the rule of law. People think that we lawyers are just there to frustrate the court system. But I hope when you have read my book, by the way, it's only written in Dutch yet. But anyway,
Got a lot of studying to do.
Okay, well, make sure you get a
Brush
translation.
up on my non-existent Dutch.
That I might convince you, anyone in the audience, that defense lawyers have a different role than frustrating the criminal justice system. We have a prominent role in defending the rule of law. And at the moment, you are attacking legal institutions as the judiciary, but also the prosecution service, which are part of the rule of law, and lawyers, law firms in the United States, then this is really of concern. It's what your colleague mentioned. I've the article here, probably you know the Professor Scott Cummings. He's a professor of ethics in the UCLA School of Law. He says it's alarm phase 1 now in the United States, alarm phase 1, because our law firms, indeed, what you rightly said, under the decrees of Trump, they have bent for the power of Trump, and they have abandoned certain cases. They are now doing cases in the direction of what Mr. Trump really desires, which also begs the question, and that's what Professor Cummings also writes in this article, very interesting. Mr. Trump, of course, he is a non-lawyer. Who is advising him? He must have lawyers who advise him to write these decrees. And this also raises, for me, a very ethical question, whether as a lawyer you should lend yourself to assist your president by writing these decrees. It remembers me of, as you know, the torture memos in 2003, 2004 for the Guantanamo Bay prisoners, where lawyers, prominent lawyers in the United States, were willing to draft torture memos saying to which level you can torture a human being, beyond which level it's not allowed. But there is apparently, in view of certain lawyers, a level to which you can torture.
Yeah, John Yoo, who's a faculty member at Berkeley, yeah.
And now the same question arises with these decrees. And I think the International Bar Association has a duty to also investigate those lawyers who are instrumental in advising a president to actually indirectly invade the 14th Amendment in terms of law firms who are sanctioned if they don't bend towards the politics of Mr. Trump. So that was my second observation, that the importance of the legal institutions, the integrity of the institutions. And as a criminal defense lawyer, I've some friends there in the United States who resigned from law firms. Some of the big law firms who were partners, they earned thousands of euros a week. And they said, we don't want to sell, we don't want to work here if this law firm is indeed bending towards the direction of Mr. Trump. And I think these are the legal heroes we should respect.
Coming back to these law firms, you mentioned them as well, of course. And you said 1 billion.
So 1 billion in free legal services to go towards what Donald Trump wants them to do.
And they pledged by several firms.
Several firms collectively pledged $1 billion in free lawyering for Donald Trump for his nonprofit causes. So he would identify, we haven't seen whatever the agreement was, but that was, they agreed to do that in exchange for him not retaliating against them by canceling their security clearances, canceling all their federal contracts, not letting their lawyers come into federal buildings. And, you know, I mean, I've had this conversation with lawyers in Washington whose belief it is that, well, we have this fidelity to the client. And so we have, you know, we either, we did not protest that, even though we haven't been targeted. This one lawyer I spoke with, criminal defense lawyer, but we have a fidelity to the client. And I pushed back, no, you have an obligation to the rule of law, and this is designed to deny people a defense, which I don't think anyone anticipated this. It wasn't in Project 2025. But I want to make one other point, which might not be clear to everyone. Oh, go ahead.
But just to be clear, undermining the rule of law, this is, of course, a biggie in your words.
Well, it's a biggie, but if you can't have a lawyer because the lawyer is afraid to, if they represent you, if you're Hillary Clinton or you're Jack Smith, if they represent you, then you'll lose your business.
Exactly. Yeah.
Then that leaves people unrepresented by the best lawyers in the country.
These firms agreed also not to defend people like Hillary Clinton.
People on the enemies list. That's the understanding. Some firms are pushing back. But you made a really good point with prosecutors. so much of American law is what some would call a gentleman's agreement or norms. It's not, it's just this idea that you don't do certain things, right? You don't wear shorts and flip-flops to the Kennedy Center for an opera, not because you'll be arrested, but you just don't do it.
Yes.
So there was this idea that, and I did a column for Politico on vindictive prosecutions. It came out this year about the law around whether you can have an actual defense if someone comes after you, if the government comes after you illegally. And what I found was that the law is developed to assume prosecutors act in good faith. So there really isn't a legal defense that's robust. Up until Richard Nixon, of course, the famous Saturday Night Massacre, when he was being investigated, he started firing people in the Justice Department. After that, there was this wall put up between the Justice Department and the president. It's not an actual wall. It's not even a law, but essentially for every president since Nixon, they've basically pledged, Republican and Democrat, to have the Justice Department operate independently of the president, independently of politics. So Joe Biden got a lot of heat for pardoning his son. I was one of the few in the country who actually supported him, in part because he allowed his Justice Department to prosecute his son in 2 jurisdictions, and they went through a whole jury trial. At any point, Joe Biden could have pulled the plug on that prosecution because he was president and he technically controlled the prosecutors. But there was just an understanding, out of respect for the rule of law, the neutrality, the idea that we have a fair justice system. He stood back, and every president before him. Donald Trump has merged that. And Pam Bondi, as Attorney General, has come out publicly and said, we work for you. We work for Donald Trump personally. So it's a completely different world. And as you probably know, there's been a mass exodus of career prosecutors out of the Department of Justice. Yeah. They're either fired, they're reassigned, or they just can't do this anymore because they're serious lawyers. Yeah.
I would like, because we're talking about the law firms and the method. At
this point.
And the method that Donald Trump is using. And I would like to
undermine the rule of law is one of his methods, but it's
exactly
a big method.
So there's a Big Tent method to it. And I would like to focus on the activism part of it, because one of the big activists of the MAGA movement is Mr. Russo, and he was big in attacking schools, for example, and the whole war on education and what you can teach and not. And he has this interesting philosophy, or, well, I'm not sure interesting is the word. He has this philosophy where he says you want to go after institutions, whether it be law firms or schools or universities or media, whatever. You want to go for their power, for their money, and for their reputation. And that's actually exactly what the Trump government is doing. And I think it's an important method to understand, because if you see that, you can see the modus operandi of the government, and that, this is law firms, but it's what he's applying to the rest of America. And it shows you that the idea of government that the Trump government or Trump or the people behind him is offering America is a very different way of using the tools that you have. So I think it's important to add that too.
So to come back to the first sort of introduction I gave, it goes further than vengeance.
Yes. It's
not vengeance, because it's not only the firms who prosecuted him or his organizations. It's much more by design than that.
I think so. And it's a tool for implementing power and for terminating your opponents or whoever you see as your opponent in a democracy. And it's a method that clears the way for him to rule. And also, it's also ideology. And I mean, you can debate politics and you can be more on that side or on that side. That's all perfectly fine. But the playing field, the level playing field has to be there. And I think his method is eating at the level playing field. And maybe we can get to but we can do that later, how there's no political debate anymore in the role that Donald Trump has played in that. But that's a whole different ballgame. It's important, though.
Maybe a question for you, because if I'm not mistaken, I read that Allen and Ogilvy, they recently merged, I think, with another firm and called now A&O Sherman or something like that. But Allen and Ogilvy, also a Dutch firm with, there's a big branch in Amsterdam. I was wondering, they go along with it.
Yes.
How do you look upon that? That's a Dutch firm. That's lawyers who are here and our partners here. How do we have to look upon the sort of the Dutch aspect of going along with something which is obviously against sort of upholding the rule of law?
Well, in general, before I answer your question, very specific, interestingly, what you said, Professor, the risk that the principle of our system is division of powers, the division between executive, legislation, and the judiciary. That system in itself, apart from what you see in the United States, is also in Europe gradually not longer absolute as it was at the time of Montesquieu, the French philosopher.
Who came up with the idea in the first place.
Yeah,
sort of,
exactly, yeah. You see also in Europe the same tendency, not so strong as the United States, and that begs the question, what happens in the United States? Could it happen in Europe? That was one of the questions I got from a journalist recently. And my answer was, I don't hope so, but you see, like here in the Netherlands, the same situation, that the executive power and even the legislator is gradually taking over the judiciary power. Last year, when we got a new government, we saw in the plan of the government some legislative bills which restrict the discretionary powers of the judges in certain criminal cases.
So the personal power of the judge.
For instance,
to interpret it in that case.
Legislative bills saying a judge cannot impose community service on a defendant if that person is charged with an assault of a ambulance worker, for instance. So there's special people, groups in our society which have to be protected absolutely. And if somebody attacks that individual, that person can never be eligible for community service. He has to be punished by a prison sentence. From societal perspective, I can understand where it comes from, but in essence, it restricts, it invades the division of powers.
It's the same sort of tendency in a...
And now I come to your question about Dutch law firms. We saw the same situation when Russia invaded Ukraine. There were two big law firms in Amsterdam which represented the Russian Federation, and they were kindly asked to cease the relationship with the Russian Federation as a client, which created, of course, an ethical dilemma, because there were also law firms representing Russian citizens, which in essence had no dealing as such with the war. And that begs the question whether you as a lawyer, you have a moral duty to cease the relationship with your client if you know that this client comes from a certain country which is in war. I think every law firm makes its own decision. It balances, of course, and you see it also in the articles about the United States law firms, that the financial interests are sometimes so important that it outweighs the moral, ethical side of the story. I cannot give a judgment call on Allen and Overy. I'm not part of it. I wouldn't dare to say something about their management. But I think if you look at the essence where a lawyer stands for, we have all given an oath on the Constitution. And that means that if we are pressurized by a government, and actually I can give an example, we defended for 12 years a person who was incarcerated in Buenos Aires in Argentina. He was accused of participating in the death flights under the Fidela regime. He came to the Netherlands. You know the case of Julio Bosch. It's all the way, by the way, written in this book. Now, where I come from, after 8 years, he was acquitted unanimously by the court, and he was the only person out of the 55 officers of the Fidela regime who was acquitted in the ESMA II trial.
So I'll know who to call.
Exactly.
It's my turn.
Yeah. In the 5th year of our defense, we filed a complaint to the Dutch government saying, you don't do anything for this guy. He has the Dutch nationality. He is in a prison in Argentina.
He's a Dutch citizen.
Dutch citizen. You have to assist. We didn't even receive him. We didn't even receive legal aid from our own government. We went to the ministry. We went to the prime minister. They said, no, it's not of our interest, this case.
They thought it was politically not...
Exactly. For them, he was already a war criminal. Mm-hmm. We were able, with the flight logbooks, to exonerate him because he was, at the time of the death flight, he was in Buenos Aires. He was simply not guilty.
So he was acquitted.
Now I come to the story. We have time? Okay. Now, yeah, 5 minutes? Okay.
No, not five. Okay. But
at a certain day, I remember it, and Carrie is my witness here. We said to each other, okay, the only thing we can do is go to the press. That's the only thing which apparently works here. So we are invited on a Dutch television program in a late night show with the family of Julio, the defendant who was in Buenos Aires already for 5 years. And at the afternoon, the program announced Mr. and Mrs. Knoops will appear with the wife of the daughter of Julio Bosch in this late night show, speaking about the role of the government. Mm-hmm. Carrie got a call from the chief of the consular affairs of the Dutch ministry, saying, Mrs. Knoops, no, I think I got the call first. He said, Mr. Knoops, if you appear tonight in this program, it's over. We'll do nothing for your client anymore. Really. I was so shocked. I was really...
sounds Trumpian, doesn't it?
Yeah, right. And it was, I think, 2015.
So would you say that...
Then Carrie, she called the guy and said, if you...
don't restrict what you said, because you try to force...
You need to say that nobody will hear that.
Okay. Carrie said, you have to retract what you said. It's a threat. If not, we will
sue you.
Mention this in the.
We'll mention it in the television.
Yeah.
Okay. But
anyway, that's the example.
You retracted?
Yes.
He retracted.
Okay. So you didn't mention it in the.
No, we didn't mention.
But you wrote it down in your book.
Yeah. But the example, for sure. Yeah. No, but it means that you have to be independent. You can never be threatened by a government. And if a law firm is threatened by a government to seize cases or to do certain cases, my personal opinion is a lawyer should never allow it to do it.
No.
I think it's against the principle where we stand for, namely a oath at the Constitution and not an oath to the government.
So we're investigating attacks on sort of the rule of law by Trump and his administration, and this is a big part of it. Maybe to come back to that question about the army and the military, and because if I understand from The Economist, and I got it somewhere here, I think I got a quotation from The Economist. The Economist had an interesting article already last summer where they said, is the American Constitution dictator-proof? And they concluded it's not. There were sort of 5 pages. At the end of the 5 pages, very clear it's not. And there's one part of it, and you mentioned it, you hinted it as well. Congress granted the president emergency powers to keep order in times of crisis. This is The Economist. Under the Insurrection Act, a president can deploy the army or navy against a domestic uprising or when federal law is ignored. Presidents have invoked this authority 30 times to break strikes, overcome segregation, and most recently to stop riots in Los Angeles in 1992. which is quite some while ago already. And you said, yeah, he sort of told the army, the Minister of Defense, that to investigate how to, help the local police forces.
Yeah, so the reason I think this is such an important point that Lila made is that, again, it comes down to what's going to stop Donald Trump from continuing this. He's not a benevolent king. He's a malevolent king. That's why he was elected.
That's why he was elected.
I mean, I think
Can you
meaning
explain
some
it a
people like the fact that he breaks things, that he's tough, that he's a macho, that he's a cowboy, that he's not going to respect the norms, that he's going to push back against the big bad government. So I'm saying,
So you're saying he was being elected because he's
and so I don't think this idea that there'll be some internal check will somehow be what'll stop him. It has to be some outside force. So if he crosses that line, which he's flagged, I think, in this order, that he wants his defense secretary as well as the attorney general to look at taking military into the streets next to regular local police. We do have the Insurrection Act. We have the Alien Enemies Act, which is how he's justified these deportations. This judge recently said it was illegal. Congress has done a lot of dumb things a long time ago. A lot of our law was built without a guy like this in mind.
Yeah, obviously.
So the question will come, if and when that day comes, will people follow the order? And what I'm saying is legally they should not, but it will take courage and it will take collective action. And I think a group decision within the military, our higher calling is to the Constitution, not to this one man. But I wanted to just highlight, I think, a few things to crystallize under our Constitution what the issue is. One is we have two parties. John Adams wrote to his wife, Abigail, that he predicted American democracy would end, what he said, in self-suicide because there's just two parties. Right now we've got one that's pretty much a fascist party, and we've got a lot of voters who support that. We don't have a parliamentary system the way that you all do, where you have to get a coalition. It's all or nothing. The Supreme Court serves for life. It's very hard to amend our Constitution. It's been amended 27 times, but there's been over 11,000 proposals to amend it. It's extremely difficult. And so there's a lot of ambiguous language. And the Supreme Court in 1803, in a case called Marbury versus Madison, gave itself the authority to interpret whether the Constitution has been violated by the other branches. Long story short, it adds a lot of stuff to the Constitution under the guise of interpretation. And just like Donald Trump, I think, is outside the realm of normal for presidents, this Supreme Court is outside kind of the gentleman's agreement to have a good faith interpretation of the Constitution. And for me—
And you said in your introduction that it's corrupt.
Yes. Yeah, I was just going to—
Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I mean, they're nominated, and then it doesn't, from afar, you would say like corrupt.
Yeah, well, and I know, I won't name them, but I personally know some people on the Supreme Court. I mean, they're not bad people, but from a legal perspective, I mean, just in a day-to-day, they're nice people. Not all of them, but from a legal perspective, just from a legal analytical perspective, right?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
That it's okay. You have to have an intellectually honest approach. You hear in the news, okay, these liberals who created abortion out of nothing, they're activist judges, and the conservatives read the plain language and then get in their time machines and interpret it based on the timing when the Constitution was actually ratified. Yeah. The problem with that is they're not doing that. So I'll tell you why, and the corruption is in part because we've had public reports about the billionaires giving goodies to certain justices on the Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas's wife was at the Capitol on January 6th. She actually called the chief of staff to encourage Mike Pence to not certify that election.
Not this.
The last time for the January.
The uprising, so January 6th.
Yes, that's what I meant, right? January 6th. And, the Democrats controlled the Senate and didn't even investigate that. So the Democrats are kind of asleep at the wheel. They're too afraid to do anything. But we've got both houses of Congress controlled by the Republicans. We've got the Supreme Court, the far right, and I'll tell you where they lost me on the intellectual honesty. It had to do with abortion, okay? So Roe versus Wade said 24 weeks. Government cannot interfere up to 24 weeks. The idea was due process. Okay, due process, you get a hearing. The Supreme Court held in the 1920s in a case involving a law in Nebraska banning the teaching of German after the First World War. And somebody went to prison for violating the law and went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, you know what? Due process and liberty means something more than you get a hearing. There's certain stuff government just can't touch. That no matter a hearing or not, government can't tell you what language you teach your kids. It said government can't tell you who to marry. There's this whole list. It's from that case, Meyer versus Nebraska, that we got abortion. Abortion's not some crazy thing that came out of nowhere. But the reason that they lost me, this court, was because the Supreme Court,
yep.
It said 24 weeks. Government can't do anything for 24 weeks. Texas came along and had an 8-week ban. The Supreme Court upheld the 8-week ban, even though there was still established law at 24 weeks. They should have reversed themselves before they upheld Texas, the Texas 8-week ban. The constitutional law was 24, and they allowed an 8-week ban to go into effect. So they defied their own law. I mean, this is what I would teach first-year law students on their first day. Like, you gotta follow the Supreme Court decision that's there. If you don't like it, you reverse it. They didn't do that. And that's when they lost me. They're smart lawyers. The other thing is, I mentioned—
So you're no longer convinced of their independence,
exactly. I'm like
ideologically—
I'm like, this is not about the law. This is about something else, because they're not doing—
About what?
I mean, I think it was ideological. The last 3 were put on the court because they were expected to reverse Roe versus Wade.
But then the big question is, where do we go from here, given that this is the situation?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's why I'm in the Netherlands. I hope other people can help. That's why I have experts like these. You know, I think, like I said, I think it's good. It's the barn has to burn down. It's burning down, and I don't think Kamala Harris. I know you interviewed Tim Walz, which was an amazing interview. I don't think we were going to avoid this because there were so many things that are structurally wrong with the Constitution, but it does need to be changed. We don't have a right to vote in the Constitution. It's not in there, which makes it possible to do all these, like, you know, cute shenanigans with voting rights, which disenfranchises people. We now have Trump versus US that makes the president a king when he commits crimes. That's got to be, something has to be done with that. But Congress can change the jurisdiction of the court. We don't need a constitutional amendment to fix the Supreme Court. We need a new Congress. We don't need a constitutional amendment to fix the Electoral College. That is a state-by-state decision. You need new people in the legislatures in the states. And I think the big thing, and the last point I wanted to make as far as why are we here? We're here because we have a two-party system. One of them is radical/fascist, and you know, experts on this, like including yourself, would say that. The other is the Supreme Court. The third is misinformation and disinformation. I mean, the Trump administration is purging American history from official websites, purging health data. The National Weather Service has been deactivated, and you know, a lot of the agencies that are supposed, like, we're not going to get a flu vaccine this year. He deactivated that panel. NIH is getting stripped. Experts are getting fired. So
National Health Service, NIH.
Well, I mean, it's still there. The National Institute for Health, which is the largest health research institution in the globe. Everyone in this room has benefited from the work of the NIH, which private corporations won't do because they can't make money. So government does it. So, you know, our phones feed us algorithmic, it sorts information based on what the algorithm believes to be our pre-existing biases. Americans, everyone in this room, gets a completely different news feed. This wasn't the case with Richard Nixon. BBC, I was in the green room, a member of Congress, one of the first to tell Nixon he had to leave from the Republican Party, said it's because people read the Washington Post, everybody got the same set of facts, and they said, we're done with you, Mr. Nixon. That's not possible right now, and this purging of data. So to answer your question, you gotta make sure you have good information.
Yeah.
Everyone has an independent responsibility to educate themselves, to figure out how to get accurate information, and to teach your children how to do that. That should be in kindergarten, not how to find information, how to sort
quite a long
information.
view, though. Teach children in kindergarten.
Or they can teach you.
That's not going to help the midterm elections, isn't it? So, Laila.
So many ways to go here. One thing about the media, because you addressed, if we're talking about information and misinformation, I think it is important to note how Donald Trump is treating the media and the fact that the White House is now giving press briefings exclusively to MAGA media, which is pretty.
Well, there's legacy media as well, but
there are actually Levitt, the press secretary, is giving on the side exclusive press briefings to just MAGA media, and the thing that's happening is that pretty figures who are on the outer sides, like who are more extreme right, let's just call it what it is, who are on the fringes now become mainstream because of what the White House is doing. So there is a funnel of misinformation that gets bigger because of what the Supreme Court is doing, the White House is doing. And you mentioned Joe Rogan, and I think it's very important that he's actually also, in this case, criticizing the White House, because we hardly see that from right-wing media. So there's a whole rabbit hole to go down into on media. But I also want to address something else, because you mentioned the Democratic Party missing in action. You somewhat touched upon it. If you talk about resistance against everything that's happening right now, you need the legislative power as well. You need Congress. And we all know that the Republican Party doesn't exist anymore. There's a vessel, the institutional power of the party, that is now MAGA. And whatever is left of the ideological GOP is just a bunch of people floating around with no institutional power. So that's a problem. And then there's the Democratic Party, who I would say is going through something that's the same, but not really. You see the biggest energy, the biggest resistance within the Democratic power is, you already mentioned it, Bernie Sanders and AOC, who are basically doing the opposite. They are using the vessel, the political party, although they don't really, they're independents. So Bernie Sanders is an independent senator from Vermont, and AOC literally says, I don't work for the Democratic Party. I work for a broader people movement. And I was in Folsom, California 2 weeks ago at one of those rallies, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and what struck me was that who was missing in action? Usually if you go to, I don't know if anybody has ever been to a political rally, but usually if you're a Democrat standing there, then you ask like the local chairperson of the Democratic Party to come, or like the local governor. There was nobody from the Democratic Party. Who was there? The Working Families Party. Who was there? The union. Who was there? Another union. So what Bernie Sanders and AOC are doing is they're using the vessel, the institutional power of the Democratic Party, but they're creating something else. And their message is not just to Donald Trump, their message is to the Democratic Party. And they're saying, we are the real People's Party. And I'm very curious to see where that's gonna go, because they're really activating voters to go vote in the midterms. But there's also a lot of people who support them but don't vote. And I think it's a problem for the Democratic Party that the biggest action is there and not in the rest of the party.
So that's another problem.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's yeah.
Great.
Sorry. There we go.
There we go. I'm going to turn to the audience almost. Yes, you might come in, please.
Yeah, so I have one question, maybe also when we speak about solutions, if there are any. I was intrigued by your analysis of the role of the Supreme Court as the highest judicial organ in the United States, which also has the power to interpret the Constitution. Could, in your opinion, a solution be, hypothetically, that in order to depower the Supreme Court, which is now, as I hear you out, a more political body, and we have the same discussion in the Netherlands with our own Supreme Court, that you would have a separate constitutional court You have the Supreme Court as the highest court of the land to, of course, give rulings on criminal, civil law, tax law, while you have a constitutional court, which is not actually selected by the politicians, but selected by the judges themselves. Would it, in your view, depoliticize the current Supreme Court? Could that, in your system, be a part?
Yeah,
I
no,
know
I think
it's
that's
difficult.
a great idea. Joe Biden commissioned a big report. It didn't come out to the end of his end of his term. It wasn't all that helpful at the end of the day. But one of the recommendations was that because the Constitution only creates a Supreme Court. It doesn't create any lower federal courts. It doesn't say how many justices. It doesn't even name justices. In theory, the entire federal judiciary could be John Roberts, the Chief Justice. And, you know, Mike Johnson said, we're just going to dismantle the lower federal courts. He could do, the Congress could do that. But Congress could create a separate constitutional court and have it rotate with judges from all over the country that had different points of view. Absolutely, that would not require a constitutional amendment.
Okay, thank you.
One last question, Gert-Jan Knoops, for you. I think I read somewhere that you said, I was trying to look it up, but you said if I would written it a little bit later, I would not have said als de rechtsstaat faalt, maar wanneer.
Wanneer?
Wanneer de rechtsstaat.
Question of when, in time.
Is it a question of when in the Netherlands?
Right now, we have the same concerns in the Netherlands on a different level than compared to the situation in the United States. And
so we're running 5 years behind, or how many years are we running behind before it collapses here?
The criminal law system is in fact not longer here to protect our citizens, but it's just to assist the government in criminalizing cases. And that's really, from the perspective of a criminal defense lawyer, very worrisome.
So as Dutch citizens, we should be very carefully looking at the United States because this is sort of what we're headed for?
Well, not in the extreme, but you see some elements of what happens in the United States also here in Europe. Yeah, for sure.
Not only in the Netherlands.
Yeah, not only in the Netherlands. Yeah.
So we have a next evening on our constitution and whether...
The book is meant as a wake-up call, so to speak.
Okay, even more trouble, but okay, that's fine. And like I said, there might be people who want to come on with a question. I might remind you that a question is a sentence which sort of ends in a question mark. Just to be, I'm sure everybody knows that, but if there's, I would, yep, that's excellent.
Thank you all for coming. I kind of had a similar question to Professor Knoops, but I suppose I'll ask it to both of the legal experts. How would you go about depoliticizing the Supreme Court of the United States?
Depoliticizing the Supreme Court of the United States?
Well, they're there for life, so you'd have to change the structure, like we were just talking about. The Supreme Court, the jurisdiction, the kinds of cases the Supreme Court gets is decided by Congress. So Congress could say, you're not getting these big cases about the scope of the president's power. For example, they could create a more neutral court where the justices or judges would rotate in and out. But so much of why we are where we are is because the Congress is dysfunctional. I mean, I mentioned the Congress is answering to billionaires and corporations and foreign donors. That's how you get elected in the United States. You have to have tens of millions of dollars. You have to know important people, and you have to be willing to make compromises. And that's made its way into the Supreme Court itself. In this moment, they're young. You know, the new justices, Alito and Thomas are not. The new justices are kind of young. They're going to be on there for a long time. Congress could expand the size of the court. Franklin Delano Roosevelt threatened to do that during the New Deal because they were striking down New Deal legislation. And I should just note, we're picking on Donald Trump, but I mentioned that Lincoln, who was a Republican, actually, President Lincoln, he crossed some boundaries, and FDR. There were the same debate we're having now about an imperial president was happening under FDR, who's now heralded as kind of a hero because of bringing the United States through the Second World War. We have a memorial in Washington, the FDR Memorial. My grandparents were still alive. We went down there, and they had this somber. My grandmother was almost in tears, standing there. He was their savior. But from a constitutional scholar point of view, he pushed some boundaries, and that's why this made it in the news. We have 2 terms for presidents. That's because of FDR. But in this moment, unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot that can be done about this Supreme Court unless they personally feel that their power and the respect for the institution is going to wane. So I've been wondering, I mean, now that Donald Trump has violated a Supreme Court order, which everyone thought would never happen, they said he needs to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He has not done that. So he, in this moment, stands in violation of a Supreme Court order. Will they wake up and say, whoa, we went too far, and we need to start exerting ourselves if we're going to retain any kind of legitimacy? It's almost a psychological game. But legally, unless we get a new Congress, which is very difficult, I think we're stuck with this. Yeah.
I think depoliticizing the Supreme Court starts, I think, with the selection process. That should change. That means that in principle, in some European countries, the judges themselves, they produce a list with candidates which are eligible for the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, based on their quality, capacities, legal skills. And ultimately, of course, then the government decides on the list. But then you have already a certain safeguard implemented. But that's, as you said, requires, of course, a drastic change of a system in the country. And the question is whether in the United States that system will ever change. Maybe now that Mr. Trump has violated the Supreme Court order, people might say, okay, then we have to do something about it. But at your question, I think it's very important. If you speak about independence of the Supreme Court, it really starts with who are you going to select and how are you going to select? And if you give this into the hands of a president or a Senate, then you have already a precondition instituted for a bias for a non-dependent, independent body.
Yeah, I have a question for Ms. Kim Wehle, or Mrs. Kim Wehle. If you, on one hand, you have Trump, who is not respecting the Constitution at all, and you have a military apparatus where a lot of military people are respecting the Constitution and made a pledge to the Constitution, do you think it's feasible that a coup could be the next step in the U.S.?
I mean, I don't know. There are people, academics have talked about good coups. I don't know. Maybe we need a new language for that. I guess and this gets to Layla's question as well, that I think is really the salient one for everyone now moving forward, which is what is next. So if you take the logical conclusion of where we are, we could have a blue wave in the midterms. We have a new Congress. Would that mean that he would feel, okay, I got to back off because somehow I'm going to lose my power? Congress doesn't have a military, right? So even if there's a blue wave, I'm not sure what shifts it. Corporate America and billionaires could decide they're done. There's a lot of power. So, if there's C-suite folks, there's corporate folks in the room, I think there's power in big corporations exerting some kind of influence if they decide an oligarchy, an autocracy is not good for business. I think that's really important. And then I think it's, to answer your question directly, no. I cannot imagine the U.S. military doing that because they are dutiful soldiers that understand the chain of command and answer to the commander-in-chief. What I thought, what we were talking about a little bit was if there were a direct order to bring the military out into the streets of the United States in a manner that's inconsistent with the law, would those people who are very, very trained to listen to the chain of command and the president, would they say, no, I'm not going to do that? That's when I talked about the rupture of the Civil War, something really cracking open in the United States and giving an opportunity maybe for some real reform. I don't know what that would look like. That is one possible scenario that I don't think we could rule out, that we'll get into that kind of conflict in the streets at one point. Yeah. And remember, we have 400 million private guns in the United States. More than people.
I would like to add another option that a bunch of people have told me on the road, and people are talking about a walkout. So and this is sort of visionary, but a mass strike in the U.S. I'm not sure who I'm looking at actually, so I'm going to turn around again. Oh, there you are.
The gentleman in the back.
Okay, so that was kind of weird. Yeah. But I'm telling you this because also, in addition to what Kim was saying, in the Declaration of Independence, there's actually the right to revolt for the people if they think that their government is really doing something that is not acting up to the idea of America.
There's something like a private militia, which
that's really in the Second Amendment, right? Yeah. Is the right to bear arms, and then the idea.
No, I think in the Declaration of
Independence isn't like a source of law. It's like
but it's like aspirational. It is aspirational, and we're looking for aspiration, right? Yeah, and people do believe that, and they actually quote that stuff randomly between ordering a sandwich and a coffee.
They believe it. Yeah.
I'm just adding it. I'm putting it on the table because we are forgetting the most important factor in U.S. democracy, which is the people. And I do believe they have big power. You mentioned the idea and the aspiration of America very much being alive. It's something I sense, I feel, I hear. It has to be activated. But when, push comes to shove, when it's really going to be the worst scenario of all, we still have the people.
I just don't think Americans have not been tested in this way.
No, it's true.
So I don't. We don't have a structure of organized resistance or activism. I mean, there's pockets of it. There was, of course, the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, but they're really we don't have that historically. And what I don't know is if we've never been invaded. We're such a big country. If that is ignited, if that spark of I think that can be powerful. I just don't, to your point, know what that moment would look like and what would happen on the other side. But Americans are not going to take whatever's coming lying down.
No, I agree. And then there's you've never been tested this way, but there's been the civil rights movement. There's been, all those activists that I talk to, they say, what if Martin Luther King gave up? And it's because I'm addressing that because it's fighting against very, very anti-democratic forces, whether it's money in politics, whether it's, all the flaws in the Constitution that are being made, or a king or a president that's reigning as king.
There's been a revolution, of course, and there's been the NA.
Exactly,
NA. Sure. Gert-Jan Knoops, on this point?
Yeah, on this point, the question of the gentleman about could the military in the United States enter into a coup or in a revolt, it's not necessary because apart from whether you have allegiance to the Constitution or to a president, I served myself 2 years in the military, the Marine Corps, and a military officer has the duty to refuse an order, no matter from whom, if that order is manifestly illegal. In international criminal law, there is a development visible since the rise of the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal, where I also worked as defense counsel. And in the statute of the International Criminal Court, you find now a rule saying that if a soldier receives an order from his commander or from a minister or whatever, which is manifestly illegal, and the question, of course, is what is manifestly illegal, he should refuse, otherwise he's criminal liable. A military commander has a responsibility that his troops will obey international law. That's also development of the last 2 decades, that we see in international criminal law an increase of criminal responsibility for military commanders and even subordinates. So if Mr. Trump would give an order, issue a decree which in view of the military, would be totally unethical or even manifestly illegal, contrary to the Constitution, the military should refuse in a way. Otherwise, that individual could be criminal liable. And that's I think...
So they don't need to
right.
rise up just to need to hold the law.
Yes, they should just say, we will not execute this order because it's in violation of. And that's, I think, a fair defense. And if Trump is going to court-martial that individual, I think that a good defense lawyer will issue this defense. So, anyway.
I think we're...
Problem solved.
Wonderful. International law. It's a great concept. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great concept.
Yeah.
If only you take it seriously.
The last question.
Yes.
To Vera, we've heard Trump talk about a third term a few times now. I was wondering, what's the general opinion in the USA about the third term, and is it a possibility of happening?
I mean, in general, it's the impossible questions. How do Americans feel about X, Y, or Z? Because there are so many and they're so diverse. In general, people don't like the idea. I think the interesting, and there's like constitutional barriers to go there, but I think the danger in floating the idea around is that other people start believing it, and then it becomes a reality in itself. So I see it as a possibility.
I agree with you. Bingo.
There we go.
It's about time we close off. Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you very much to the audience. Before I close, I'd like to say a few things about our program, but I think it's also very important what we just said at the end. The American people have not been tested. Yes, have been tested. You know, it might be. Are they up to? I mean, I think the Georgians are now more than 160 days of straight protests in cold before their parliament buildings, because they have been tested, very much tested, and they're not able to dislodge their sort of oppressive Trumpian government. If you look at the Belarusians, they have been 500 days marching, nobody cared, and Lukashenko is still there. So, I mean, this is a really disturbing conversation, I would say. We leave it at that. I'm very proud. I'm very proud and excited to say that at the end of June, we'll be hosting a special edition of our Forum on European Culture, and that's titled "Art Against the Tyrants." And thanks to Mr. Trump and many others, it becomes more and more topical. We'll have 5 days at the Bali of global speakers on authoritarianism, and Applebaum will be amongst them, but also Caroline de Gruyter and Adam Phillips and many, many others. Art Against the Tyrants, Talks Against the Tyrants. Thank you very, very much for sharing your ideas and speaking out so violently and so well, not violent, that's the wrong English word. I mean, I would say
powerful,
vehement, and there wasn't any violence in it. There was a legal structure in it. But thank you very much. And I again, at the end, I think we should really honor your courage and take good notice, because like Gert-Jan Knoop says, you know, we're maybe not that far from a collapse of our rule of law. Thank you, Laila Frank, for coming from the United States and telling us about it. Thank you.